This is episode 405 of the Rio Grande Foundation's Tipping Point, New Mexico. I'm Paul Gessing.
And I'm Wally Dringmeister.
I'm president of the Rio Grande Foundation, New Mexico's free market think tank. You can find out more about the foundation at riograndefoundation.org. Wally, we're getting into prime time, if you will, on voting. The early voting convenience centers are now open, and this is the time I and my spouse, my lovely wife, like to go vote because you can get in and out like a team of Navy SEALs very quickly, no lines. So, folks, get out there and go vote. Have you voted yet, Wally?
I have not, although I did think about it yesterday, but I got too busy. So I think today or tomorrow is probably when it's going to happen.
Yeah, we've got time within the early voting paradigm, a couple weeks here of that, but there's a lot of early voting convenience centers spread out around here in the Albuquerque metro, but around cities and towns throughout the state of New Mexico. Nice and cool today, so you won't get turned into a crispy critter there running from your car to the voting convenience center as well. At least here in Albuquerque, after some pretty hot weather there in mid to late April and early May, we've got a nice little cool spell.
And breeze as opposed to wind, so always take that.
Yeah, hopefully that has a positive impact on the fires still burning across our state. I know some moisture fell in parts of New Mexico, but we can always use more of that. And, Wally, I sat down and talked to the major candidates for governor on the Republican side. Of the races that are on people's ballots this year, I think the one that's gotten the most attention and will get the most attention is the race for governor on the Republican ticket. Michelle Lujan Grisham has upset quite a number of folks, I think, left, right, and center. And the Journal poll is out, and I think it shows what we kind of were expecting all along, which is that Mark Ronchetti was going to parlay his name ID into being the likely choice of most Republican primary voters. So I'll run through it, and then your comments are welcome. 45% for Ronchetti, 17% for Dow, 9% for Zanetti, 8% for Block, 1% for Maharg, 21% undecided or don't know. These are 560 registered Republicans who voted in 2018 and or 2020 Republican primary elections and said that they are likely to vote in the 2022 primary election. So this is a pretty representative sample. And while polling may not be what it once was, 45% to the next person at 17% is a pretty significant gap there.
Yeah, a couple of points, Paul. And the first is it's not that many years ago that when, since governors could succeed themselves immediately due to four-year terms, it was difficult. There was usually none or one barely candidate to challenge a incumbent governor, Democrat governor. And I'm not going to disparage any of the candidates back then, but let me just say that I think there were four strong candidates. There are four strong candidates this time on the Republican side, and that's good to see them challenging for that. And then, in addition to the name recognition being the weatherman, Mr. Ronchetti, if you look at where Rebecca Dow is, in TRC in southern New Mexico, if she maybe represented Las Cruces and had a little more of a natural constituency geographically, I think she might have done a little better. But, not that, 17 points from that is a bad showing, far from it. But I think that that's one of the things that hurt her. And then the other two candidates, their campaigns didn't seem to necessarily catch on fire, although they both brought a lot to the table. And so, this would be an amazing thing to see if we see lots of strong Republican candidates challenging for statewide race from the Republican side. That would be a fantastic thing to see.
Yeah, and we at the Rio Grande Foundation are nonpartisan. We don't choose candidates in the final election nor in a primary election. But I would just echo broadly what you say. Is we had the four main candidates were all broadly in the center right group, the ideological spectrum. Nobody was far more left leaning or progressive. Nobody was far to the right. Positioning is one thing. In terms of policy prescriptions, another. And being far right at a governor level in New Mexico is different from being far right in a presidential primary or presidential election. So you're dealing with a whole different suite of issues. So nobody separated themselves as being particularly awful or particularly different from the rest of the group. And in a group like that, you're going to have name ID, and that really rule the day, I think. And I do hope that the candidates, whoever does win, that there is a high level of unity, that there is cross-pollination, and that there is working together. There's certainly been a lot of intensity, a lot of some negative campaigning, and you expect that in any campaign. But ultimately, I think the electorate of New Mexico, not just Republicans, is much more interested in who is challenging Michelle Lujan Grisham, how they're going to challenge her and her policies. And I know a lot of Republicans, independents, and even some Democrats are hoping that whoever comes out of the Republican Party process will have a great deal of success against Governor Lujan Grisham and her policies for a variety of reasons. So we'll see how that shakes out after June 7th. But I wanted to get a few thoughts in there about where things stand in this particular primary. So the unemployment rate in New Mexico remains the nation's highest as of April. We are at 5.3%, where we've kind of been stuck. And in typical times, 5.3% is fine. It's a reasonable unemployment rate. But other states around us are seeing much lower rates. New Mexico is also struggling and continuing to struggle with workforce participation rates that remain depressed. So we do have the highest unemployment rate in the country. And that's not a good thing. It's a testimony to, despite the hard-pressed employers finding workers, despite wage growth, despite inflation, all of these things stack up, and you still have a significant number of New Mexicans that, for whatever reason, claim that they are unable to find a job. And I don't get it, because I see, we all drive around and see jobs available, but apparently in New Mexico, there's enough people out there looking for employment that we still have the nation's highest unemployment rate. And real quickly, in Texas, the rate is 4.3%. In Colorado, it's 3.6%. In Arizona, it's 3.2%. Oklahoma, 2.7%. And Utah, 1.9%. So, there are jobs available, but just a lot of New Mexicans, for whatever reason, aren't ready to get them.
Yeah, and Paul, I've been thinking about this, and these are questions to which I do not have answers. Is who are the 5.3? What makes them up? Is it that they don't want the jobs that are available, or are there pretty substantial numbers of people that are difficult to employ that the employers say I'd rather limp along with nobody than to have these people. And again, it's never 100% anyway, but I've heard a lot of business owners lamenting the ability to attract employees when in the past they've had a much easier time, and the question keeps coming up: where are they? Where are these workers that I used to be able to to be able to attract to my business. So yeah, New Mexico, there's something going on here, and I'm not sure exactly what it is, but it does seem to be a little bit different than our surrounding states. And let's just leave Utah out. Utah is different. You know what I mean? It's one of those, they have a very young population. There's a lot of things going on, but when you look at Texas and Arizona, we have a lot of similarities with them.
Yeah, yeah. Utah is a very different state, and certainly you can attribute a lot of that to the heavy LDS influence. But they have low education spending, far lower than New Mexico, and high educational outcomes. There's tremendous, not just unemployment rate being low, but their workforce participation rate is incredible. And I don't know, maybe we just need to do a Mormon attraction scheme
Yeah.
here in New Mexico.
Well, they are the beehive state, which the beehive being a metaphor for being industrious, and it certainly it certainly is playing out that way recently in Utah.
No doubt. Well, just because our unemployment rate remains high doesn't mean money is not flowing into New Mexico's coffers. And this is a dichotomy that the Rio Grande Foundation has attempted to kind of discuss and illuminate. And we've talked about it here on the podcast. The Albuquerque Journal reported Dan Boyd on Friday, May the 13th. He had an article about the revenue bonanza continuing to fill state coffers. Revenues are tracking at $440 million, higher than even projected in December. And these are, of course, projections that are based on kind of the current status of the industry, the oil and gas, the economy. So $440 million above where they were expecting. Is a huge revenue windfall, 15% budget increase last year. We've seen some tax reductions from a group that's not inclined towards reductions. We've seen these one-time refund checks that that the governor has been trying to hand out in order to boost her reelection chances. So those should be hitting your bank accounts, and at least the first tranche should be coming in the month of June here. So I mean, oil and gas obviously it just continues to be very, very strong. As I sit here right now, according to Yahoo Finance, the price of a barrel of oil is $110 a barrel. And that means mucho dinero coming into the state of New Mexico. But as we just said, the relative strength of the non-government economy is not as good. But these are happy, happy times for the state budget.
Yeah, no question about that. And and if this, as long as the forces that are in play in New Mexico continue, yeah, we will have a lot of money. But there's a lot of things that are going on. The underlying products that are created out of oil, diesel prices across the board are roughly double where they were a couple years ago, and diesel is the product that's used to move most everything that is physical. Everything that we eat, wear, building materials, and the like. The stock market is definitely taking a beating, and high energy prices and the stock market struggling sometimes is a precursor for a recession, which is something that people are concerned about just based on history. So things are great right now, but stay tuned. They could change in the not too distant future, but. Maybe we'll keep these dollars unspent or give them back to the taxpayers. I think that's a fantastic first attempt, and they did good. Giving some money back, and maybe this will happen some more in the future here in New Mexico. Maybe we'll get to be like Alaska.
Well, yeah, we would love to see some actual reform come to our tax code and tax structure as a means of developing the rest of our economy and making our state more prosperous and less overall reliant on oil and gas. I am under no illusions that this governor has that kind of vision or interest. But
Well, Paul, $440 million is plenty of money to reform gross receipts tax.
that's
No doubt
absolutely,
about that. Will they do
absolutely.
that? Again, I've held my breath on gross receipts tax changes historically, and I've passed out every time, and I'm going to quit doing that. So
Stop holding your breath, Wally.
exactly, turning blue doesn't do anything to reform gross receipts tax in New Mexico.
Now, the following article is particularly troubling because you know we don't deal with a lot of these topics in a way that brings the absolute bottom line to bear. But we're only quoting from the spokesman for the Food and Agriculture Organization within the United Nations. The economist is named Maximo Torero, and we're talking about energy. Now, we know that energy is a life and death issue because sitting around in the cold in the winter and the heat in the summer, not having refrigerated food when the electricity goes out, not having a working heater in the wintertime, all of these things can be flat out deadly. But the fact is that even we at the Rio Grande Foundation tend not to talk about oil and gas as inputs, feedstock into certain things that make the world go round. And in this case, we're talking fertilizer. Natural gas accounts for between 75 and 90% of operating costs in the production of nitrogen, and which is used in fertilizer for a range of crops, including corn and wheat. And an article crossed my desk that quoted Maximo Torero, the chief economist at the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, who warned against moving away from natural gas production too soon, arguing more people will starve to death if the consequences are not thought through. In addition to energy, Wally, I know the baby formula deal, that shortage is a huge looming issue for a lot of families out there. But the food situation in many parts of the globe is of concern. Energy prices, of course, in the transportation sector are part of that, as are inflationary forces in general. And there's significant concern among people at the highest levels talking about the UN regarding the global shift away from traditional fossil fuels and natural gas production and what that could mean for fertilizer production. So it's a very serious issue, especially outside the United States, where food insecurity tends to be a much more pressing issue. But
yeah, and then Paul, when we look at fertilizer, China is the largest producer of fertilizer. The United States and India are second and third. Less than half the level below. But energy and fertilizer go hand in hand. So a lot of the countries that produce a lot of energy also can produce fertilizer. And so, yes, it's a big deal both in the U.S., but certainly worldwide as these prices go up.
yeah, so something to definitely keep an eye on. And we certainly don't want anything like the worst case scenario to happen, but we also wish that our policymakers in Washington were making better decisions on energy issues. And one of those policymakers in Washington is a New Mexican, Deb Haaland, Secretary of the Interior. She's had a very left-wing pedigree on these issues, protested the Keystone XL pipeline up on the Canadian border, really made her name as being one of the more radical, if you will, members of Congress for the short time that she was indeed there on energy issues. She was testifying in a Senate committee on oil and gas leases, and she was called onto the carpet by none other than Democrat Joe Manchin, who expressed concern about the administration and Interior Department's leasing program, And what Manchin seemed to believe, and I believe rightly, is further stalling and great reluctance on the part of the Biden administration to expand domestic energy production. So it's notable both for the very direct approach that Mr. Manchin took, Senator Manchin. And you can look at this. It's posted at heirsoфenchantment.com. It's just a minute or so of a clip of Deb Haaland testifying. And it's obviously, Manchin is in many ways the most powerful man in Washington, D.C. He is a Democrat, but he comes from an energy state, at least a coal-producing state. Definitely not somebody of the far left ilk, although to call Manchin some kind of closet Republican would also seem to be inaccurate, because we know that guy's taken a whole lot of stuff from the Democratic side of the aisle and still remains firmly in the D camp, when West Virginia has moved much more into the Republican side of things. And we did a whole podcast about that with Garrett Ballingy, head of the think tank out there in West Virginia, a few weeks ago. But interesting footage there from that Senate hearing, Wally.
Yeah, and it is interesting, Paul. We're seeing, not certainly oil prices are up, and what can be done domestically to bring those down with additional production. But we also have the United States has a lot of regulation when it comes to refining product, making things like fertilizer and the like. And, you can argue that we ought to go way further and go to the point where we don't make anything in this country. And I think that's some people's goal and wish. But, I think the rhetoric of the past in terms of what wind and solar could do are being kind of laid bare right now with what's going on. And not to say that there won't be battery powered and hybrid vehicles and moves towards that, but in terms of boy, if it's going to be as quick and as draconian as a lot of these things are proposed, we are in for some very interesting, very tough times on things like extremely high fuel prices, high and unreliable electricity prices, battery prices going up astronomically, and what that means just for the U.S. economy and the world economy.
Yeah, and as a side note on that, there was a report this week, and it's also linked in this article. The Biden administration has begun the process of reducing or easing sanctions on Venezuela and their oil industry. Now, whatever you think of the power or lack thereof of economic sanctions placed on other countries, whether it's Russia in the Ukraine war or Venezuela, which is certainly governed by a group that's antithetical to American interests and our way of life. The idea that the United States and its government seems to be moving more towards allowing Venezuelan oil on the market while cutting back and shifting away from domestic oil production. It doesn't make any sense from a political perspective, nor does it make any sense from an environmental perspective, because I can suspect and I can point to data showing that Venezuela does not do as much to protect the environment when it comes to its oil and gas production as do American producers. Very strange move here. This is not the first time we've seen this. There's also efforts underway with this administration and Iran and other countries.
Yeah, and then Paul, one thing I will say about the Venezuelan oil production sector is any sanctions the U.S. places on Venezuela pales compared to their horribly operated energy sector by their very dictatorial government in terms of damaging that. Because there are a lot of countries that would buy the oil that Venezuela would produce if they would produce it. And, I think this is the U.S. Sanctions were largely symbolic, but boy, they have a lot of trouble. Political infighting, corruption, a lot of things that are associated with state-run oil and gas operations. Venezuela has them big time.
Yeah, it's definitely not a policy shift that I would like to see. Whether you want Venezuelan energy on the market or not, I think that is a open question, but certainly not at the expense of American producers, and that's just crazy. So uh, we have a list here that I want to go through briefly because it's easy to forget, and we are in an election time, and we at the Rio Grande Foundation want to make sure that voters are aware of the issues affecting energy. And there's been a lot of talk about, well, the Biden administration, what impact does the president have on energy? And I think we've made very clear that he has had a significant impact on energy. And some of these are New Mexico by way of Washington, D.C. But the post is available, airsofenchantment.com. 5 recent times New Mexico Democrats have made or tried to make energy more expensive. Number 1, Energy Transition Act. That's the coal-fired power plants elimination. That's going 100% renewable on your electricity bill. And that's something that is very important and impactful. And there's still a lot of concern, I think, rightfully, about the ability of the lights to stay on in the not too distant future as PNM struggles to get enough power on the grid to replace the San Juan generating station, which is closing in September. In fact, a friend sent me a Facebook post. Maybe you saw this, and I don't want to sidetrack us, but we could talk energy here. PNM issued a formal request asking energy developers to submit resource proposals that could add up to 700 megawatts to the PNM system with guaranteed in-service dates before May 1st, 2023 or May 1st, 2024. This comes as the company expressed concerns over a potential energy shortage leading up to summer of 2023. The request for proposals is an effort to secure new capacity resources to serve customers by the 2023 summer. So this is, if I may, Wally, this is like the equivalent of a lazy schoolboy or girl.
Does anyone have last year's test that I can take a look at?
The night before.
The night or the morning of.
Yeah, because I don't think many in the energy field are saying, why, yes, we do have this ready-to-go natural gas or
700 megawatts.
That's a significant amount.
That's a big chunk. Yeah.
So anyway, any brief comment on that before we move on with this list?
Well, after hearing that, Paul, we've tongue-in-cheek talked about the personal home generator index. And with that, the index ticks up to 90 out of 100 in terms of, it makes you fear for reliability of energy in New Mexico. And believe me, and we've talked, it's not just New Mexico, it's California. Mm-hmm. And then you throw in, Texas, and you throw in a few states around having trouble. And this thing, there could be energy problem contagion that happens within the grid as well. And it's not just one state, one company. A lot of things could go wrong, and there's a very frail state of electricity reliability where we are right now.
Yeah, and this, as I understand it, is a PNM Facebook post, and it really does just crystallize everything we've said about the Energy Transition Act over the last few years. Okay, we will move faster.
And it's kind of like, Paul, I was wondering, do you know anyone that's got megawatts of power that they're not using? I'd take that off their hands. So
just a spare modular nuclear reactor sitting around or something.
Or a gas power plant.
We laugh because there's only so much you can cry about, and this is this is not good news. But again, it needs to be discussed before the election because the governor's policies are directly causing this, and I can't emphasize that enough. And just because the electricity hasn't gone out yet doesn't mean that we're not very much behind the eight ball here in New Mexico.
Yeah, and then the other point just on that is that the Green New Deal was basically laughed out of Washington as being just a horrible idea and not something that could be done. But when you look at California and New Mexico, we've done an awful lot of that, and
Yep.
so we are the point of the spear. And I'm not sure where that spear is pointed, maybe into a concrete wall. But yeah, there's a lot of policy issues, and frankly, I think that's based on bad engineering and wishful thinking. And I've often talked about aspirational regulation. It's like, well, if we don't put something out there, they're not even going to try hard. Well, they're trying hard right now, and it looks like they're not necessarily going to be very successful at it.
Yeah. The number 2 on the list is the Clean Car Standard, which of course is directly relating to energy. We won't belabor the point, but obviously a massive shift potentially in the offing from gasoline to that electrical grid that this is, I can't even, the metaphors fail me, but it's like somebody who is already in debt, in a massive debt to somebody, going out and buying a house that is, $5 million or something, and saying, "Oh, we'll figure that out later." Number 3, Interior Secretary Deb Haaland, a New Mexico politician, controlling millions of acres, hundreds of millions of acres of federal land, and continuing to drag her feet on leasing and royalties. Michelle Lujan Grisham pushing through the clean fuel standard, or trying to. That's the one that failed on a tie vote that would have increased gas prices at the pump by 35 cents per gallon. Our friends in the Republican Party often message this as a tax increase, and you have folks like Representative Matt McQueen on Twitter saying, "It is not a tax increase." And so I respond, well, it is a 35% regulatorily imposed increase in the price. Are you defending that? And then he does not respond on Twitter. At least a tax increase, you might have better roads in the offing. Regulatory mandates increasing ethanol in the gas tank, not a good idea, and not helpful to the cause either.
Yeah, and people ask, why are prices for gasoline and fuel so much higher in California than they are even in places like New Mexico? And it's not just, they have multiple regulations like this one that was proposed.
Yeah, and there was a sign I just saw, $7.29, I believe, was the price somewhere in Los Angeles. 5, just 1 year ago, it's hard to believe, but June 8th is the date of the letter, 2021. A group of 24 so-called progressive New Mexico Democrats sent a letter to the Biden administration applauding the ban on new oil and gas leases. Now, if this is not a ready-made election issue for at least those 24 so-called progressive Democrats who are essentially saying, yay, we want higher gas prices, we want less money flowing into New Mexico, I don't know what is. But there's that letter has kind of been pushed into the dustbin of the memory hole. But and a few others, Antoinette Cedillo Lopez, state senator's ban on fracking. Of course, that's not gone very far, but it's a very direct attempt to dramatically increase fuel prices across the country, limit New Mexico oil and gas revenue. And Governor Lujan Grisham, just as recently as this past legislative session, pushed quote-unquote net zero legislation that, if adopted, would have radically increased energy prices in an attempt for New Mexico to be a zero carbon emission state. So those are 5. Actually, there's 7 because those 2 at the end, I couldn't help myself. I just didn't feel like doing 25. But these are very specific, detailed examples, primarily, obviously, at the state level. But there's a lot for everybody to get their teeth into. And, it's just reformulating information that a lot of folks are familiar with if they listen closely, but it's more usable in those bite-sized chunks like that.
Yes, and you could have maybe added a lot of these a few years ago, and it's kind of the putting the frog in the pot and then heating up the water. Maybe it could have happened gradually, but with what we're seeing now, any additional costs or disruption in energy in New Mexico is certainly going to be noticeable by the person on the street. So,
Yeah, and if you don't think that policies, just because they fail, like a tie vote, for example, in the clean fuel standard, and numerous others, uh, you know, several years ago, the Obama administration imposed utility regulations that were thrown out by the courts, but these policies do give business leaders pause because they understand the way the wind proverbially is blowing, and they get very gun shy when it comes to new investments in energy infrastructure, and they pull back and they don't want to spend the money that would ultimately bring more of their product on the market. And this is one of the things you're seeing right now with oil and gas. There is a oil and gas or anti-oil and gas mentality among basically half of the population as expressed politically. Maybe you're a Democrat and you're not against oil and gas, but the people you elect, by and large, are proving themselves to be anti-oil and gas, and those policies and those ideas are making it very troubling for those people to invest lots and lots of money. So this time may indeed be different when it comes to traditionally you get high prices, a lot of investment, new production comes on, prices drop. Sometimes they drop a lot to the point where those investments go awry, and then you have higher prices down the road. We may be in this more of a new normal situation.
yeah, and then you talk about things don't need to pass necessarily to have an impact. If you're a refinery owner that's looking at doing long-term maintenance or capital investment on your refinery, and you're not sure what type of gasoline is going to be required, and all these formulations, you might just just wait a while, and then what will that do? And again, oil is great, but it is a feedstock to things that are going down the line that make it useful. And just a final flyer of a thought out there, Paul, is if we have 100%. If we have 100% electric cars out there, all the problems that's going to have. We've talked a lot about that, but guess what those electric cars use to drive around is they use tires made out of synthetic rubber that comes predominantly from oil on asphalt roads that come predominantly from oil. So it's not, this kind of, you might get away from using gasoline in increasingly in sectors, but no, this oil is a pretty valuable commodity for which there are a lot of uses that are not going to go away in my lifetime, or I have a feeling my grandchildren's lifetime.
Yeah, and finally, the New York Times covered a Harvard study that has just been published. The New York Times, which not always a fan of their reporting style, but they did a great job. And this Harvard study is pretty hard to deny. It really takes on the issues of lockdowns and locking kids out of school during the COVID pandemic, something that we've talked about Lujan Grisham having done, much to the detriment of New Mexico children. There's a lot to be said in this post. You can find it at errorsofenchantment.com. But the Harvard Center for Education Policy Research points out that schools with high numbers of poor and minority students were the most likely to go to remote learning, which in and of itself is unique because you're looking at the broad array of public schools across our country. And, you have Texas and you have Wyoming, you have New Mexico, you have California. And clearly, the more blue the state was, the more likely they were to be booted out of the classroom for long periods of time. That is pretty much indisputable. But of course, where you have more high poverty level, more minority students, those are blue districts, generally speaking, within blue states or blue districts within red states. But regardless, the Harvard researchers noted that the average number of weeks remote in 2020, 2021 for high poverty students was 13 and a half. For low poverty and mid poverty, it was only 8 weeks. Now, average weeks remote, we were close to a full year in New Mexico. So we're 4 times about the amount of time lost in the highest poverty schools. And certainly New Mexico is going to fall into the high poverty category. But that just gives you an indicator of how restrictive, even relative to other states, New Mexico was. And this quote, whoever does win the Republican primary for governor, should probably appear in some kind of campaign ad, because this is a Harvard researcher saying this will probably be the largest increase in educational inequity in a generation. So the difference between the way conservative, higher income, less minority population districts and states acted during COVID, exacerbated to a greater extent throughout this generation than any other policy, the educational inequity that we already face as a country in student outcomes. So pretty damning stuff.
It is. And then, Paul, in places like New Mexico, a lot of rural areas that are poorer than most urban areas have horrible connectivity issues. So that that quote unquote distance online learning was degraded even further. And I do believe, and I believe I said that during the first year of the COVID shutdown, I think we're going to need an education catch-up initiative. I mean, some emphasis on that. And have we heard anything about that? We when we have all this money in Santa Fe, and talking about again in Santa Fe, we talk about the inputs to education a lot, not about the achievement and the attainment. And this just shows that, will New Mexico need to do something? If we want to catch up, we're going to need to do something. We were towards the bottom before. I don't think anything that happened over the last 2.5 years definitely helped improve our education broadly based compared to all the rest of the country.
Yeah, and quite frankly, adding an extra 10 days onto the school year, or doing, paying teachers more, pouring more money into the education system, none of that is actually going to do much for student outcomes. You cannot get in the time machine and go back and change the way you approach the pandemic. And of course, the national study from the National Bureau of Economic Research made sure to include education and time lost in the classroom as one of their 3 big variables. And we talked about this throughout the pandemic. We've talked about it since the pandemic, because we so strongly had concerns about what Governor Lujan Grisham was doing. And, as a personal, parent, I pulled my kids out of traditional public schools and homeschooled them for the bulk of the pandemic year, where they were not in the classroom, and we have since left APS. And those aren't isolated decisions made by just conservative think tank heads in Albuquerque or in New Mexico. It's been done by parents, I can confidently say, across the political spectrum, and throughout the state of New Mexico, but especially in APS and other districts like that. So.
Yeah, and this is not just a COVID phenomenon. There's a lot of places who are in horrible school districts and urban centers across the country that took their kids out, even though they espouse basically the public school systems that they wouldn't send their own children to. So,
all right, well, we will leave it there. Thanks for listening to this week's episode. Find all episodes at tippingpointnm.com or at the Rio Grande Foundation's YouTube channel. Subscribe to this show at Apple, Stitcher, or have your Google Home play Tipping Point New Mexico. Thanks to Path 3 Marketing for producing this show, and go vote.